So that's probably the biggest game in the West this week. We're going to hop over to the East and talk about a big game every year, Tennessee at Florida. Florida had a tricky opener with Michigan, and it wasn't the offensive production that we had hoped we'd see from them, but secretly expected we might, especially with some players out. And then you double up that with the fact that you didn't get to play a game last week. It got canceled, and now you got Tennessee rolling into town, who did get their tune-up game last week, but hasn't looked great this year either. So when you have a new face at quarterback, which we have on both of these teams, you really want those tune-up games to really get them going before they have to face heavy competition. Looking at this game, I'm pretty interested because I don't know where to go with either of these teams. We feel like both of these teams have a lot of potential to win the East, potential to be a mid to high ranking team, and we think they have the personnel to do it, but then we don't see results in the field that groove with that concept. So I think we got to see one of these teams at some point step up, and I'm here to ask you, are either one of these teams that team to do that?
Short answer is I don't know. There have been flashes from both. I think they both have the talent to do it, but I think they're both also a long way from being the sort of team they need to be overly successful. We said, we did a whole series of previews, right, on SEC quarterbacks going into the season. There were a lot of ones we talked about. I took a lot of flack for saying that Stidham might be a little bit overhyped, that he probably wasn't the dual threat passer that people thought he was in terms of his running ability, and that shockingly he may not be as accurate in the short to intermediate passing game as the number four passer in the country in accuracy in Sean White. Obviously, after the Clemson game, I was proven completely wrong, and will have to apologize profusely. But the other two other quarterbacks we talked about quite a lot were the situations at Florida and Tennessee. Tennessee, Dormandy, we were both actually pretty high on. I know some people are sort of ragging him that he hasn't produced better. He's only sitting about 6.5 yards per attempt right now. But I thought he's been solid. I mean, he's passing for 6 yards an attempt in the opener against Georgia Tech, which was not a great defense, but it was a serviceable one. 7.8 yards per attempt against Indiana State. I know Indiana State, but regardless, sitting around 55% passing on the season. And, we got a pretty good year last year out of Dobbs before things were done. But much of that was bolstered by the end of the season when they faced Kentucky and Missouri and Vanderbilt and then Nebraska all in a row. And like against Vandy, he was a 91% passer, and it really boosted a lot of his stats. For the rest of the year, I mean, again, against Appalachian State, Dobbs was a 55% passer against Appalachian State and averaged 6.6 yards per attempt. And right now, that's almost exactly what you've got in Dormady. And I think there's very much a chance for him to improve. I think Callaway is really stepping up as a receiver, shows a lot of potential. The injury to Jennings is extremely concerning, but there's signs there. And then the flip side on Florida, we said that we really wanted to see Franks probably take the job because that meant Franks was better than the options they did have. Regardless, it seems pretty clear they didn't think that the other guys were necessarily the answer. I think, I got to give my partner here, Daniel, some credit because I think he hit the nail on the head when he went off and said, he didn't think Malik Zaire was anything near what he was cracked up to be, just looking at his statistics outside that one game against LSU. And I think we all just saw that on national television. One of my biggest concerns out of that Michigan game was Franks was not overly effective against Michigan, to say the least, but he wasn't really, that terrible either. It's kind of frustrating to me because he was, 55% passer, averaging 8.3 yards per attempt, and had not thrown an interception. And they pulled him to put in a guy in Zaire who they thought might give him a spark. But what Zaire ended up doing was he threw for a lower completion percentage and for a lower yards per attempt at 52 and 6.2 respectively. In fact, he was
in negative 29 yards rushing.
Right. And, the fumble in the end zone. So I know they needed a spark, maybe sort of to win, but I thought at 8.3 yards per attempt. I mean, he'd only thrown 9 passes. So let's keep that in perspective. I know he'd held on the ball a couple times more than he should have, but he'd only thrown 9 passes. He was actually being pretty darn effective, and they yanked him about and threw twice as many passes with Zaire for not anywhere near as much effectiveness. I almost feel like they robbed themselves of the shot to make anything out of it. But the flip side of that is, I also think if they go back to Franks, which I hope they do, because I think Zaire has pretty much proven in that game that he was a disaster in my opinion. I think there is something to build off of. And when they get Scarlett and when they get Callaway back, get some weapons for Franks to work with, and he gets a lot more comfortable, not playing an elite defense in a huge game, in a huge neutral site game matchup against an elite team in his first ever college start. I think Franks has the ability to improve. So I think both these teams have a lot of potential at the quarterback position. I really do. Right now, I think Georgia has the edge in the East, just where they're at the moment. But it's pretty fascinating because you've got, probably the three best teams in the East, all with first time starters in From, Dormandy, and Franks. And the progression of those guys is really going to determine the way the conference plays out. And moreover, when the games are played. I mean, the fact that Florida and Tennessee are playing now in week 2, it wouldn't shock me if Dormady is going to be the better player. I say week 2 for Florida, but it's week 3 for Tennessee. And you have a guy in Dormady, let me check how many passes he's thrown. I mean, he's thrown 67 passes in college, right? And Franks has thrown 9. So the experience level is actually pretty disparate at the moment. That Dormandy's thrown just way, way more college passes and taken way more snaps than Franks, even though it's this early in the season. And I think one of the interesting things here is I think it gives Tennessee a little bit of an edge they may not have later in the year.
One of the things that concerned me coming out of the Florida game, probably less than the quarterback play, because I don't think anybody expected the quarterbacks to be great in that game. You talk about how it's good to have a little bit of quarterback competition in the summer, but I think some of the fact that Florida had a quarterback competition this summer was concerning to some because they expected Malik Zaire to maybe come in and just take that and run with it. I didn't have high expectations for the quarterbacks in this game. I did expect a little more on the ground, and I expected a lot more from the play calling. And you and I have been critical of Nuss before. We will be again. What I felt like in this game was the whole game was called backwards, and it was called, instead of giving your running backs an opportunity through the air, loosening up the defense a little bit, and giving your quarterbacks opportunity with well thought out, maybe shorter routes, which he's kind of known for. None of that materialized. The play calling wasn't creative. It was very straightforward. It was very tight, very like, we know we got a good defense. We're going to play it super close and hope to win in the end. It didn't happen, and it didn't click with them that it needed to change soon enough. It scares me that they're not running the ball. Florida, for all of their warts last year, could run the ball a little bit, enough to drag themselves to the SEC East winning finish line. I don't see them doing that this year. And on the flip side, we've got John Kelly at Tennessee, who's been doing pretty well. I mean, he's been. We were worried about Tennessee losing all that production at running back last year, and Dobbs running the ball. He was a lot of production there as well. Kelly's really stepped it up, which we'll do our picks later, but it has me leaning Tennessee, if for no other reason that if we call the quarterback to draw, Tennessee's got a running game. Is that fair to say?
I think it's very fair to say, and there's a lot of reasons for it. I mean, Tennessee has, I think, a pretty solid offensive line. Richmond is a decent left tackle, still not quite where he needs to be. They got a 5-star freshman in Trey Smith sitting at the offensive tackle spot that, I mean, he may not know what he's doing yet, but if he gets his hands on you, he can push you out of the way. Florida, strangely, for all the returning starters, I mean, they're just anemic. And it's really hard to say because we have one game as a sample size, but they could not do anything at the line of scrimmage. I think some of it's probably honestly on the running backs. I don't know that there are any of those backs between Thompson, P. Ryan, Davis that are really scary, honestly, at the college level. And I think a lot of Florida fans do appreciate that fact that none of them are remotely what Scarlett is. And Tennessee at least has a solid back in Kelly. I'm not sure that he's, honestly world changing again, but he's pretty good. And yeah, I mean, we'll have to see what happens. But you've got one team that averaged 6.7 yards per carry in the Georgia Tech win. Still kind of honestly amazing. They only ran the ball 22 times, considering they were averaging 6.7 yards per carry. But that had a lot to do with the fact that Georgia Tech never let them get the ball back. But on the other side of the ball, I mean, man, Florida, you the leading rusher in that game was Mark Thompson with 5 attempts, 5 carries for 13 yards, 2.6 yard per carry average. And maybe Michigan is just that phenomenally good on the ground, but that's just it's beyond alarming. You're breaking in a brand new quarterback. You don't have a ton of you don't really have any at the moment, any experienced talent at the skill positions, and you don't have any running game whatsoever to speak of. I mean, that's not good, man. I mean, it's just not good. And until you can run the ball a little bit to take some pressure out of the quarterback, things are not going to get better.
And on the flip side, because in most situations, we if we're picking between two teams, one's got an offense that's ahead of the defense, and the other's got a defense that's ahead of the offense. We generally lean defense. So, having said all that about the running attacks and the fact that Florida's got a couple players coming back, is this Tennessee defense that we said coming to the year wouldn't be great? They gave up gobs of points to Georgia Tech. I get it's a weird attack, but you still gave up gobs of points, and you lost a ton of production off that defense last year. So even with the caveat that Georgia Tech has a weird attack, your defense is probably not that great. And Florida, your defense has already played a top 15-ish team and looked really good. Does that swing you in the other direction if we're saying, okay, Tennessee's offense is ahead of the schedule compared to Florida's, but Florida's defense is probably quite a bit ahead of Tennessee's right now? Is that enough to make you kind of lean in Florida's favor, knowing the issues in the running game?
Yes. You kind of stole my thunder there a little bit, but the concerning thing in this game is as much as Florida couldn't run the ball against Michigan, I can excuse that because Michigan's Michigan. But I get it was a triple option. The rush defense was flat out concerning against Georgia Tech. I mean, they gave up 6.2 yards per carry. It was 86 carries, over 500 yards rushing. And again, I get it's the triple option, but in an opener, there are ways to scheme against it. You run the 4-4 set or a bear, and there's certain ways to attack it. And it's not a blip on the radar either, right? I mean, Tennessee was
it speaks to their depth too, right?
yeah,
like
they were 104th in the country last year in rush defense, 104th, and so the question is, are they better? Well, game one says no, they're not better. I mean, Georgia Tech is not a ranked team. They're not expected to be overly good this year. Georgia Tech lost their Justin Thomas, the starting quarterback, who was a massive cog in the run game. I honestly thought the quarterback that stepped in for them did a really poor job in that Georgia Tech game, and they really weren't executing the triple option well at all. And in fact, if they didn't fumble the ball a few times, they would have beaten Tennessee. And that's easy to say, and I get that, but they broke off a long run at the end of the game, and all the guys got to do is hang on to the darn ball when he gets tackled, and you're not going to catch them. So, we already thought this was going to be rough just from losing, the players that lost, like Barnett. Then you have a guy like Kirkland goes down with injury. Uh, I don't know. I think they may be okay. It seems to pass the ball a lot. Like Kongbo has the potential to be a good pass rusher, but the problem is that guy may be a good pass rusher, but he's not nearly big enough against the run, and he gets moved out of the way too easily. And I just kind of use that as an example, but they're all the same problems they had last year when they were so injury depleted. Those guys that stepped in due to injury are the guys that are starting this year, and I haven't seen anything to make me think that the defense is going to be any level better. And the moment Florida actually can run the ball somewhat, They do have talent at the receiver position, and they are going to be able to leverage it. And on the flip side, Florida's defense, as bad as the offense looked, Florida's defense looked freaking stinking good. And you're going to have a quarterback that's for Tennessee that's going to play an entirely different level of defense than they faced at Georgia Tech. And I don't really see the skill players for Tennessee with Jennings banged up that they need to really generate points. So, I mean, I think the game's going to be ugly, but at least it looks like Florida can move the ball, and I'm not really sure Tennessee will be able to.
So let's wrap this up. Give me a score. Tennessee at Florida right now. I think Florida's like a 5.5 point favorite. Not a ton of movement in that. So, what do you got?
Probably Florida 24, Tennessee 13. That's about my guess.
Interesting. So, do you think in that 24? I know this is super hypothetical and unfair. How much of that 24 is because of their defense, either from turnovers, scores directly from defense, or like non-offensive touchdowns, or super short fields?
I'm guessing most of it, probably 14. We'll say 2 touchdowns come as a result of turnovers or short field position.
Okay. And they prove in week 1 that they can do that. I think Florida as well. Coming into this show or today, just kind of thinking about it all week, or it's only Monday, but all week with Florida, not playing a game, I kind of felt like Tennessee would have that advantage having that second game. But when I look at this team, not counting special teams, because I don't know that we know a whole lot about either one of them yet from that standpoint. When you look at the 4 units, both offensive and defensive on each side, we see bad on both, and we see some okay on Tennessee's side offensively, and we see 1 unit out of the 4 that's pushing good to great, and that's Florida's defense. So, if it were the other way around, if Florida's offense was great but had a trash defense and Tennessee's defense was good, I'd probably lean Tennessee. It's probably a little confusing, but you got 1 almost elite unit out of the 4, and it's Florida's defense. So give me Florida 23, Tennessee 14.
Okay, so we're not too far off, either one of us.
No, and this is another tough one to pick. Again, I'm a broken record. We don't have a lot of data for either one of these teams. We're not high or low on either one of these teams yet because we just don't know what to expect. We are a little concerned with Tennessee's defense given last year, and I'm concerned, kind of like I said earlier, about Tennessee's defensive depth. They've got some good frontline players, but, man, it showed in that Georgia Tech game that they really lacked the depth to just gut out a stop at any point. So, and the fact that they got in such a hole in that game scares me a little bit. It's the flip side of what A&M did to UCLA. And Tennessee did that a lot last year, and I had hoped that they had sort of put that behind them, and it looked like they hadn't. Anything else on this game, Tennessee, Florida?
No, I think that's about it. We can just take this game and dunk it in the trash can and call it a game.